Last week I mentioned there was a book that I really liked by Dr. Roy Spencer called Global Warming Skepticism for Busy People. And in particular, I liked it because I thought it did a good job of exhibiting a lot of virtues that I look for when I read people. For example, it explained its points versus making appeals to authority. It looked for the full context. It looked for both positives and negatives for fossil fuels and of climate impact for that matter. It was engaging the best arguments of the opposition. It tried to be clear about any assumptions that it was making. It generally had a respect for the audience, and it did a good job, or seemed to do a good job at least, of expressing degrees of certainty and uncertainty. I'm saying seemed to do a good job. I think it's quite accurate, but I'm just saying if I was reading this cold and didn't know anything about it, it had this appearance of mental virtue, which I appreciate. Now, Michael Mann's book, Dr. Michael Mann's book, is interesting, and I'm learning more. I'm getting more out of it than I thought, but I want to share a couple of those points. But it is really bad in a lot of these ways, where if he's right about certain things, one of my fears in reading this is he might be right about certain things, and I'm not going to know because or most people can't know because he's so unconvincing in other ways, because his method of presentation is so deeply flawed. So let me just give you a couple of examples of this in terms of different things. In terms of explanation versus appeal to authority, he does explain some things later in the book, but the whole beginning of the book is, I find, incredibly off-putting and even condescending. And he'll just say things like, the basic facts are now clearly, and I should say he's co-writing this with a cartoonist named Tom Tolles, which that itself is a really weird thing, because the book is making these strong scientific claims from expertise. And it's like, well, there's this renowned scientist, and by the way, there's a cartoonist, and we both have the exact same opinion on these things. So that I found weird, but the guy is writing cartoons for the book. The basic facts are now clear and essentially beyond dispute. It is time to put out the fire. So there's just stuff like that all over the place. There's just this kind of condescending tone where there is apparent disagreement or continuing uncertainty. Go with the preponderance of evidence. It's not all that hard. Repeat after us. Preponderance of evidence. So it's really unpleasant, particularly at the beginning of the book. I think it gets quite a bit better, and that it's actually explaining ideas in some sort of coherent way. But it has that authoritarianism from the beginning. In terms of engaging the best arguments of the opposition, there's almost zero of this. And there is, in fact, a huge amount of just blanket denunciations of disagreeing people with no specificity. So here's a typical kind of thing. The purveyors of confusion and denial have stepped in to slow us down and lead us astray. I'm thinking, like, who are these people, and what are their arguments? Let's see, what else? There's a general contempt. There's just a general contempt for the audience, and a contempt for really humanity's use of energy, use of fossil fuels. They describe humanity as, quote, shambling around like confused zombies, unquote. There's just tons of this. And the whole idea is we're just stupid. We're using these fossil fuels for no good reason. We're just being dumb. That's this whole, it has this quality of superiority, and it's just assuming that, well, I find it the opposite of persuasive to anybody who even has questions. Now, the most conspicuous vice of this book is the failure to seek the full context. And then I'll talk about some interesting points it raises. But essentially, the failure to seek the full context, well, seeking the full context means that when you're considering a decision, you look carefully with as much precision as you can and as much even-handedness as you can about what are the different potential positives of the decision and negatives of the decision. And he'll talk about climate and the alleged effects of warming-induced climate change on things like food and water and security. And reading this book, at least so far, so I'm 18% of the way through according to Amazon, which probably means I'm about a quarter of the way through because there's a lot of footnotes and index at the end. I would have no idea, literally I'd have no idea that fossil fuels have any value, and in particular that they have any value for food, water, and security, which is curious because fossil fuels have revolutionized the availability of food, water, and security. They've just had such a transformatively positive effect on those things. So to talk about a negative side effect of fossil fuels, to talk about the negative of that and not mention any positive at all is just the opposite of logical thinking that we would hope for from a scientist. And that is just the most blatant thing as I read this book, that there's no indication, at least not so far, of the full context. And there are many, many cases where it's omitted. And then when I see somebody omitting positives or any benefits of fossil fuels, then of course my inclination is going to be, even if I didn't know anything to support this, that they're probably exaggerating the negatives. Just like if somebody can only find fault in someone who's achieved a lot, then I'm probably going to think, oh, this person has a bias and their faults are probably exaggerated. So I want to give more of a report next week. I want to continue reading this. I am finding it interesting. I mean, one way I find it interesting is I think that Mann does a good job of summarizing the different catastrophist views on different things, including sometimes explaining what the different scientific claims are. It's very frustrating that he doesn't engage with any kind of criticism. He doesn't engage. For instance, he says nothing about the people who've challenged his hockey stick in very, very powerful ways. He says nothing to indicate what the basis for their argument is. So everything I read, even if I didn't know other things, I have a lot of skepticism. So it's just hard to evaluate, but at least he does have one reason I'm reading this book is he is pretty good at giving clear cause and effect type explanations, leaving aside issues with those explanations actually being convincing. But that I found interesting. The most interesting issue I found that he addressed was, I guess there are two related issues, but they both go toward the scientific method and how he thinks of the scientific method. And one point I would put here is he makes a point about what he'll call skepticism versus what he'll call denial. And there's a real point here. Let me see if I can, I'll read some of this. He says, true scientific skepticism takes many forms. Skepticism takes place in the give and take at scientific meetings, where scientists present their findings and then address questions, criticisms, and challenges from their colleagues in the audience. It takes place in the form of peer review. Scientists write up their findings and submit them to journals. The journals select several other scientists with expertise in the field to critically evaluate the submission. If they find flaws in the data, the underlying assumptions, the experimental design, or the logic, the authors must revise and resubmit. This process might be repeated a number of times for a single article. In the end, the article is published if and only if the editor determines that the authors have satisfactorily addressed any concerns or critiques raised during the review process, and that the manuscript represents a positive contribution to the existing scientific literature. Let me see if I can find... I might have not saved properly where he talks about the denial thing, but I think I can summarize it pretty well. His point is that there's... Now, I don't think in terms of skepticism. I think it's a problematic classification. I think because it's really what you want is challenge based on evidence or lack of evidence. So he's calling that skepticism, which is okay. But then what he's saying is, well, some people are quote unquote skeptical in a way where they'll just say, well, I'm not certain of something, even if there's a huge amount of evidence, and they don't have an alternative view. And that he's right to say that is a corrupt approach, where people will just say, no matter how much evidence you have, I'm going to doubt it, and therefore I don't have to take any action on it. And I'm going to say that you don't have full certainty, quote unquote, and therefore I'm not going to do anything. And here's where he talks about. He talks about not skepticism, but rather contrarianism or denialism, the wholesale rejection of validated, widely accepted scientific principles on the basis of opinion, ideology, financial interest, self-interest, or all these things together. And this is what he's attributing to people who, question him. So I don't think he's at all accurate in doing that, and he doesn't address a lot of very powerful arguments against him and a lot of questions that have been raised about him. So he's not doing a good job of that. But I did think this was a good point about skepticism is not this unlimited virtue. So that was one thing. The other point that I thought was really interesting was his, and I think this would be convincing to many people, is his account of how science works and how the scientific community is very likely to come to the not only come to the truth, but to validate challenges, correct challenges to received truth. So his view is that the scientific community is structured such that somebody who can challenge an establishment view is very incentivized to do so. And he's saying, well, some people think it's hard to do this, but in fact, no, it's easy to do this. And so here's his part of his explanation for this. Do climate scientists, for example, seek to reinforce the dominant narrative that climate change is real and caused by humans to generate concern from the public and policymakers, just so they can guarantee the ongoing availability of government grant support for their work? And then he says, so I like that as a question, although it's framed in a somewhat straw man way, as I'll get into. But he says, the way you establish a name for yourself in the world of science is by demonstrating something new or surprising, by contradicting conventional wisdom. A record of novel, groundbreaking work is what gets you tenure, what helps bring in research grants, what leads to salary increases from your institution. Any scientist who could soundly demonstrate that Earth is not warming would become an instant science celebrity. A scientist who could definitively explain the warming of Earth by natural rather than human causes would have prominent articles published in Nature and Science. He or she would appear on the network news and make the cover of Scientific American. So, well, actually, I haven't answered this, but Stefan, what do you think of this claim? I'm going to put you on the spot.
Yeah, so I think that's not quite how it works, because so there's a process that takes place in academia where you have to publish papers and get them through peer review and get them published in journals, and that is what makes you sort of a name, the amount of publications that you produce, and that is not directly sort of correlated to your findings being particularly new and or contradicting conventional wisdom. I think so. So the career is not dependent on constantly finding something new or something that is surprising, but rather your career is boosted by, getting as many papers as possible published, for example.
Well, I don't think that's quite right. I do think that a newness element is relevant. Like if you look at what are the biggest names that have been made, they're typically people who publish papers saying that the warming and its consequences are worse than you think. So they break with the establishment by saying things are going to be way worse. I mean, we saw this, I think, a few months back with the warming of the oceans is worse than you think. Only it turned out that the calculation had a flaw in the equation. But there's something right about what he's saying. But there is an issue of when you have an establishment that has its kind of reins on funding, that I think it gets distorted, like what kind of things are recognized as breakthroughs. But then the second aspect that I think is relevant here is what does it mean to prove or disprove? And he had a line, I don't remember exactly what it was, Alex, but he's like, if you could show that the Earth wasn't warming or that it wasn't caused by human beings. But that's misrepresenting what the debate is. Like the people who are challenging him are not saying there's no warming or that human beings play no cause. They're challenging them on the degree of the magnitude of the warming and the consequences. And so you're challenging the establishment not with some over something that is not necessarily headline grabbing and headline breaking. And that becomes a very hard thing to do.
So 2 points related to the points that both of you raised. One is that there is, even absent government intervention, a phenomenon of cliques that develop. Now, an establishment, the problem with an establishment by government is that it often leads to a monopoly clique. But just even if you think about within cliques, how they develop, people who are heading in a certain direction, such as warming from CO2 is causing big problems and requires a big policy solution. Those people, there is a tendency for people to look for new and reinforcing claims. And that's to Don's, I think both of your points, but Don's point in particular. And this happens all the time, which is that, and you look at Mann himself, how he made his career, which was people were frustrated by the fact that there was this huge amount of evidence that what's called the medieval warm period existed. And there's just these examples of being able to grow grapes where you can't even grow them today, and where different parts of the world were warmer than they are today. And Mann had I think they called it Mike's nature trick, but he had a way of compiling certain forms of evidence that this is the whole hockey stick thing, which the Power Hour with Ross McKittrick goes into. But he had a way of compiling different sources that effectively made that period disappear. It made it seem like, well, all of those anecdotes were just totally anecdotal, and that it was just maybe in one little part of the world it was warmer. But in general, no, it's been cold, 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 and then it's gotten super warm. And the hockey stick is right. So the hockey stick is a perfect example of a kind of pseudo novelty. It's a convenient novelty. And what you have to look for with cliques, and in particular with establishments, are things that are convenient novelty. And then this particularly connects to when governments are funding it, because people are funding this for a certain reason. They're funding it because they're not just concerned with understanding climate. They're concerned, at best, they're concerned about the consequences of CO2. At worst, and often, they're eager for power to do something about CO2. And thus they are looking for studies to confirm that. At the really interesting little piece I read by Freeman Dyson at the beginning of a piece by Indigo Kalani, who's a great thinker who is associated with Cato, is this is with the Global Warming Policy Foundation. I think it's called CO2, the Benefits. And at the beginning of it, Freeman Dyson has the intro, and he talks about how when government was starting to study CO2, his view was you can't just study the negative potential climate effects, you have to study the full context. This is my words, but including the positive effects on the biosphere. And he said he wasn't influential back then. And so they took this negative focus from the beginning. And if you take this negative focus from the beginning, even if every single person is completely honest, what you're going to do just by the nature of the system is you're going to select and raise to prominence people who are inclined to this particular way of thinking. And then you have all this invisible destruction of people who would think differently. You never even see them. They don't even go to grad school here, or they leave grad school early, or often they shut up and they only say things behind the scenes. So there's something to what Mann is saying, but it's pretty disingenuous, because he doesn't even acknowledge, at least so far in the book, and the methodology section of the book seems to be over, he doesn't acknowledge the potential corrupting influence of monopoly science. He doesn't look at how this has affected different fields, how science can get distorted, how you can incentivize the wrong kind of novelty. He just acts like, oh, well, if you're a Galileo type who can really say that the most prominent people in the field are in some fundamentally way wrong, they're just going to roll out the red carpet. And that's definitely not true even with cliques. But when you have an establishment that is put in place by government and that has all of this infrastructure in place, different funding agencies, different people at universities getting funding, then different departments depending on funding of people like Michael Mann and their research, when you have all these grant proposals that require mentions of global warming and climate change if they're to have any chance of success, then that is going to be a hugely distorting impact. And it has nothing to do with believing in hoaxes or not, but that's just the nature of incentives.